Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Microstakes Poker Training. Today I will be continuing the $11 Deepstack tournament I started in the last video. And I was lucky enough at the end of the last video to win a large pot by flopping 2-pair against an overpair. So now I have a relatively big stack, especially relative to the blinds, but even compared to the players around me. So I can show you some of the tactics that are useful for when you develop a big stack to increase your chances of growing your big stack even larger and making it very deep in the tournament. I've outlined some of the advantages of a big stack on the right side of the screen there. And with that being said, I'll dive into the hands. One quick note, I put some music in on the background of this video. If you guys like that, I'll continue. I just figured it might be nice to have something other than the sound of my voice to listen to. But if you find it gets in the way, let me know, and I won't do it in future videos. Yeah, so the first hand I wanted to discuss is cutoff hand. And I pick up 3-3 in the cutoff. There's a limp in front of me from the middle position player, and I have a pretty clear decision here to raise. You could, I mean, it's always nice to play small pocket pairs as cheaply as you can pre-flop, but I really want to take the initiative in the hand. I really want to take the betting lead, and I also want to limit how many players I'm against. Even with an implied odd hand like pocket threes, I don't want to see the flop five-handed. I would like to be up against one or two other opponents, ideally. That would be different if I was on the button, but I really don't want to be playing out of position if I can avoid it. So I make a pretty standard raise, and it folds around to the original raiser, and he calls. And we get a flop of Queen Jack 2. So this is not a great flop for me. There's two high connected suited cards, and Jacks especially and Queens tend to be in the range of hands that will limp and call pre-flop. Aces and Kings are slightly less likely for those hands, and so this is a pretty bad board for my pocket threes under the circumstances. When the player checks to me, I do have the option to bet here, and looking back, considering our relative stack sizes, and the fact that with a big stack I want to be putting pressure on my opponents, I probably should have bet here, but I decided to check and go for a delayed c-bet. A delayed c-bet is when the turn comes, if the player checks you again, you make your c-bet then, because they haven't taken a chance to show aggression even when you showed weakness, so they're probably not very interested in the hand. So he checks again, and I decide to bet pretty standard sizing, about 2/3 of the pot, and he calls. So now it's possible I'm getting value from a draw, but I'm not very happy with my hand. And when he checks again, I could go ahead and make a big bluff on the river here, but there's not much point. Players get kind of suspicious if you don't bet the flop, and then you suddenly bet the turn and the river, unless there's a card that really came that changes everything, and neither the 7 and the 6 looks that dangerous. So I check behind, and he ends up showing the King 7, so you can see that if I had bet the flop, I would have probably gotten a fold, and because I didn't, I ended up paying him on the turn after he made his hand. But the delayed c-bet is a very valuable tactic. It's going to work more often. While risking less, you're going to work more often than a c-bet, because once your opponent has already checked twice, they're more likely to be giving up on the hand very easily. Next hand I wanted to discuss, I have Ace King in the big blind. Yeah, Ace King offsuit in the big blind. And there's a bet in front of me and a call. And so I have a decision here, but it's not much of a decision. Ace King, I will rarely slow play pre-flop, and especially out of position, I definitely want to put in a raise. So I make a fairly, actually that's on the small size for 3-betting. It's more than 3 times the original bet, but the original bet was a small one. It was only 2.2 size, the big 2.2 big blinds, and there's a caller in between, so there's even more incentive to make a larger raise by me. I would have preferred to see a sizing like 425 or 450, but 375 is fine. It's not a huge difference. So I get one fold and the small blind calls. It's a nice flop for me. I get my pair of kings and nothing else that looks too dangerous. There's a potential flush draw, potential straight draws, but it's definitely a flop I'm happy with. And I go ahead and make a pretty standard size bet. Again, my sizing is a little bit on the small size. I wouldn't be disappointed if I had bet more in the neighborhood of about 625, but 555 is just fine. And I do get a call. The turn is a complete blank, and there's no real brain surgery going on here. I'm just going to keep betting my strong hand. And so I do, and again, that time I actually only went about half the pot, which again, going back through these videos, I really noticed my sizing still needs some work, because really, I'll just show you guys again, 1045 into 1970, I mean, an argument can be made for not betting too large to keep weaker hands interested, but you really want to be getting value from your strong hands, so I'd prefer to be betting in the neighborhood of 1200 here. But all the same, there's no call, and we win a nice tiny pot, so it's always good to do that. The very next hand, I just wanted to highlight another hand that I choose not to play, and it's pretty straightforward, but I wanted to discuss why it's this kind of decision now, and it might be much different later on. So there's a raise in the cutoff, the button folds, and I'm in the small blind with ace-8 offsuit. Later on in the tournament, when players are sitting with stacks of anywhere from 15 to 30 big blinds, ace-8 offsuit might be a re-raise, it might even be a re-shove, where someone raises and I just go all in, hoping to take down his bet or get called by a hand that I'm coin flipping with. You do need to be playing very aggressively with aces in late position. I wouldn't play aggressively with an ace much smaller than ace-8, but ace-8 is right around the borderline later in the tournament that you're going to want to start gambling. But at this stage of the tournament, it's way behind my opponent's raising range, and there's still another player that hasn't acted yet, and he ends up calling. So to be in that pot would just be silly, especially if I was making a re-raise this early in the tournament. The antes haven't even started. There's no point in taking a big risk to only take down a small pot. And I'll go over quickly another hand that I decided not to play. This is another fairly standard decision, but I just wanted to point it out to you. Ace-10 offsuit here. There's a raise in early position and a call in middle position. And in the cutoff, ace-10 offsuit looks pretty nice, but facing an early position raise, I'm likely dominated. And even if I was suited, I don't think I'd be playing this hand. It's just the type of hand that's going to get you in a lot of trouble, and you're rarely going to win a big pot with it. So on to the next hand, and that would be... Okay, I'm really getting good cards in this tournament. It's one of the reasons, I think, the main reason I think that I'm managed to go deep. And here we have ace-king offsuit under the gun, and this is a pretty standard raise. I wanted to take this opportunity though to discuss raise sizing. You'll notice here I'm doing about 2.5 times the big blind. That's for the current tournament metagame, that's actually on the large side, but I really think in the early levels, when you're, even if you're not this deep, when the blinds are small, if you want to make a pot worth playing, raising to 2 big blinds or 2.2 big blinds isn't enough. Once the blinds get a bit bigger, and especially once the antes kick in, I'm not raising quite as much as 2.5 big blinds, but I never raise just a minimum raise. I just don't find that it puts enough pressure on the blinds or the players in late position to really make a decision for chips when I don't necessarily want to play post flop. I just want to take down the pot, or I want to force my opponents to pay more when I have a really good hand. So I don't like the very common strategy of min raising once the blinds get a little bit bigger. I think the minimum I ever go is 2.3 big blinds, with the exception of if there are short stacks to act behind me. I will make min raises or raises of like 2.1 times the big blind. And the reason for that is that if those short stacks then shove on me, I have saved myself a little bit of money if I have to fold. Whereas if I were to raise to 2.5 or 3 big blinds and then have to fold, I lose more money than if I min raise. But under most circumstances, I want to be putting a little bit more money out there. I want to be putting more pressure on my opponents than what a min raise accomplishes. So we'll continue on with this hand. I don't think there's any action, but I don't actually remember. Okay, I do get a call, and again, I'm just running hot. I flop a nice ace, but no action there. But still, it's a nice little small pot to add to my stack. 2 hands later, continuing the trend of big hands, I pick up pocket queens in the small blind, and there's a raise and a shove in front of me. So obviously at this point against a short stack, I'm not folding pocket queens for a shove. It's about 20 big blinds, or sorry, no, it's about 40 big blinds that he's throwing in there. But I have over 300 big blinds, and pocket queens is way ahead of a short stack's range. And so my only decision at this point is whether to re-raise and try to isolate this player or to call. In general, when a player shoves and you have a hand you want to play with, you should isolate him because by making another raise, because if you let more players come in against the short stack, even if you have a strong hand, you're just giving them a chance to outflop you, and you're also giving them a chance, if you make a big call against a short stack for a small portion of your stack, and then they make a re-raise, they put you in a really uncomfortable position, and some advanced players will do that without even having a very strong hand, because they expect to be ahead of the short stack's range and they think they can get you to fold. In this case, however, the short stack is shoving for so much compared to the blinds that I really don't expect anyone to call that would fold to an isolation raise. And if someone were to call an isolation raise, my queen suddenly doesn't feel that strong. I could really likely be up against aces or kings. So I'm just going to make a flat call here and see what my opponents choose to do behind me. Predictably, though, at this stage of the tournament, both players fold. And I'll show you what I'm up against. I'm up against ace-king. So it's, the classic race, pocket pair versus ace-king. I'm about a 5% favorite, but it's basically a coin flip. And my luck continues. The board runs out nice and dry for me, and I win the pretty decent sized pot. Next hand I want to talk about, I believe I'm in, I can't remember, I have pocket fives, I know that much. Oh, I'm under the gun, and I raise with pocket fives, pretty standard play. Shorter stacked, there's this pocket fives is an awkward hand because when you have a deep stack, you always want to be playing it in any position, and when you have a short stack, it's a good hand to play in any position and try to get all of your chips in. When you have a middle-sized stack, pocket fives can be a really difficult hand to play, and when I have something like 30 to 40 big blinds, maybe even a little bit less than that, I sometimes just straight up fold pocket fives in early position. Depending on the temperature of the table, depending on how people are playing around me, I sometimes don't like to get involved with the small pocket pairs. Even though it's a good hand, you're really going to be in an awkward situation if someone re-raises you. And when you have 25 to 35 big blinds, if you're making a raise and losing it, you're losing a significant portion of your stack. You're often losing almost 10% of your stack. So it's a really bad spot to be in where you have to choose between paying a lot or risking your entire tournament on a small pocket pair, or folding after raising when you only have a few chips in your stack. Again, depending on the temperature of the table, I will still play small pocket pairs in early position when the stacks are shorter, but the only time is it's an automatic play are when you have a deep stack or a short stack, in which case with a short stack you obviously just want to find a way to get all your chips in with a decent hand and hopefully win a coin flip or get other people to fold. Anyway, back to this hand. I raise in early position with pocket fives, and the cutoff makes a really small 3-bet, just doubles my bet to 250. So this is a pretty easy call. We both have a lot of chips, and he's not making a big enough raise to price me out of pretty much anything. I'd call here if I were in this situation with 7 deuce. I'd call, just getting an amazing price for my hand. And I flop a set, so the hot run continues. And now, this is an interesting decision because the board is such that a lot of hands that would normally c-bet aren't going to c-bet. Good players and even moderately good players know that this is a board that you don't want to c-bet with overcards. And if he only has overcards, I may not be able to get a check raise or a check call and then check raise on the turn, because it's very possible that he's just going to shut down once he sees this board. So you could really make a strong argument for betting out and hoping that he raises or decides that you're just going after this scary board and calls with his overcards. In this case, I decided to check, and he checks behind me, which is exactly what you don't want to see when you have a hand as strong as pocket fives. But the turn's a queen, and I decide to bet. I make a pretty large bet relative to the size of the pot. And that's not bad, but if my opponents were paying attention, especially if I were playing at higher levels, this would be a bad play because, as you've noticed throughout most of the video, I've been making 2/3 pot size bets, maybe 3/4 pot size bets, and here I bet almost the entire pot. So it's a huge warning sign to a wary, wise, attentive opponent that my hand's either stronger or weaker than it normally is. And if he gets a chance to see a couple of my hands when I make these larger bets, he's going to know how I'm playing. So you should be really careful about not varying the size of your bets based on the strength of your hand. That being said, this is a relatively low buy-in tournament. It's relatively early in the tournament, so I'm not too worried about giving away subtle bet sizing tells, but I do want to be aware of that in the future, and I'm going to try to get rid of this leak in my game. I don't think it's a leak in my game that shows up often, but in this video it does show up a couple times, so something I learned just by making this video about my own play. So I go out with a bet of 500 and he calls, so I'm super excited now. And again, on the river, I don't like my sizing. Is a little bit too large, I think, to be called by really anything but a queen and a strong queen. Yeah, there's really not much else that's going to call me here. And even a queen is going to have a hard time, or is going to be a little bit wary of such a large bet. I'd much prefer a bet of about 1,100, maybe 1,200 at most. But either way, I make a bet of 1,400 and my opponent folds. So I take down a nice pot. Moving on up, running very hot right now. But I do want to remind you guys, just on the flop in that hand, it's a really close decision between betting and checking. when you have such a wet board where your opponent is less likely to c-bet, you should really consider betting out and taking the betting lead, even if you didn't have it before the hand starts, rather than going for a check raise. And a few hands later, I get shifted to a new table. And it's also important to note that the blinds have gone up to 5,100. Now, I don't actually play this hand, but I just wanted to show you guys at a new table. If I remember correctly, the player sitting in the cutoff is someone that I've played against before and have hands on and respect his game. It was either the cutoff or the button, but I think it's the cutoff at this table that I recognized from before. Otherwise, I know nothing about any of these players, and I'm assuming they know nothing about me. When I get to a new table and a tournament, I usually want to start off a bit tighter, pay really close attention to how players are playing, see if I can see any weak spots, see if I can see any interesting plays by my opponents that suggest to me a strong player, and really just take my time to adjust to the table. When I have such a big stack, however, I kind of want to get the loose, aggressive, big stack image right away, and I can afford to lose a few chips if it backfires. So you will see that I'm not being super tight at this table, even though normally when I go to a new table in a tournament, I'm going to err on the tight side a little bit. In the next hand I wanted to discuss, I pick up ace-4 suited in the hijack seat. Pretty standard raise, suited ace, nobody's put any money in yet. I'm in relatively late position, and I get a call from the big blind. And this is a good board to c-bet in general, but as I said, this, I believe, I remember now, this is the player that I have some history with, and I respect his game, and I kind of assumed that he would know that this is a board that I'm going to c-bet on often with nothing, and also that it's a board that is hard to hit. So he's more likely to play back at me, he's more likely to make loose calls, and I don't really need to get into that game when I'm against a good player. So I just check behind. On the turn I pick up a flush draw, he checks again, and here, even though I know he's a good player that's going to be aggressive on this type of board frequently, I could seriously consider a bet here, because now I do have a legitimate draw in addition to my high cards, and he's shown no interest in the hand yet, so I very likely could take down with one bet, but I do check behind. I don't hate that check. I think it can go either way, and obviously, as you can see the river, the check worked out pretty nicely for me because I hit my flush, so I want my opponent still in the hand when my flush card comes, and he bets into me after I hit my nut flush. So I'm really excited here. I don't, you don't often see this, that you hit your almost nut hand. It is possible that he has a full house, but very unlikely on the river, and your opponent bets into you when there's been no betting yet in the hand. So I just quickly smile, I fake think about it for a few seconds, and I raise. I like the sizing here. I could have gone a little bit larger, but it's a little bit more than what's in the middle on top of his bet. So the sizing is pretty standard, and I'm just looking to get paid off here, but by whatever he decided is good enough to make a bet with. And he calls, and I'll show you what he had. The 7 of hearts was the worst card in the deck for him, because he makes his straight, which looks very pretty, especially on a hand where nobody's been doing any betting, and it just happens to be with the card that gives me the nut flush. So unlucky for him, and I take down a nice little pot. The next hand I want to go over is not one that I'm involved in, but I want to highlight a mistake that one of my opponents makes. I have ace-7 in the hijack. There's a raise in early position. Obviously, I'm not playing. Button calls, and it folds. So we get a flop of 8-9-5. And just so I can highlight the mistake, I'll show you guys what they're playing with right now. We've got king-jack offsuit and a set of 5s. So the original raiser makes a bet. Pretty standard c-bet. I mean, this is a connected low board, so I don't love his c-bet. It's kind of one of those situations where it can go either way. And a c-bet here is kind of a bit over-aggressive considering that he doesn't have a very deep stack. But I don't hate it by any means. It's certainly good to put pressure on your opponents and to be c-betting regularly. And the button just calls with his set, which is fine. I think letting one more card come off, giving your opponent another chance to bet whatever they might have, is usually a good play. This is a draw-heavy board, so it might be wise to raise straight away on this flop, because there are many cards that could come that beat your hand, and even though you're not that scared of that when you have trips, there are a lot of cards that could come that would scare your opponent. And even if they have a pretty good hand that would pay you off now, if a flush card comes or a 6 or a 7 comes, it's going to be a lot harder to get money from your opponent's holding and to play a big pot. So I prefer a raise in this situation on such a wet draw heavy board, but there are many occasions where calling behind when you have such a strong hand in position and waiting for the turn to make a raise is acceptable as well. Now, this is where the mistake takes place. The flush card comes on the turn, the under the gun player checks, and the button checks behind him, and this is just astronomically bad. I mean, I don't want to be a dick about it, but when a scare card like that comes and you have a really strong hand, you need to A, be extracting as much value as you can, and B, be protecting your hand, and C, if your opponent does have a flush, the best way to find out is now rather than on the river, because you can make a bet, and if your opponent raises, you can make a decision then about whether or not you want to continue with the hand, and you control the amount of money you risk by making a bet. On the river, if your opponent makes a bet into you, you're then playing a guessing game against whether or not they have that hand that they're representing, and you don't control the size of the bet that you're calling to figure out whether or not they have what they're representing. So there's a lot of reasons why you need to bet here with a hand as strong as trips, and it's a really big mistake to slow play at this point. I don't like slow playing in general. There's almost no occasions when I think it's a good idea, but this is a clear mistake, and he pays for it, because on the river, the fourth flush card comes, and the under the gun player bets his now fairly strong flush, and the button calls, which is again a mistake. Like, once that fourth flush card comes, you need to be able to fold your set when someone bets into you. And so he ends up getting punished for his slow play, and deservedly so. Next hand I want to talk about, it's sorry, it's 364. Oh yeah, okay. So I have King 6 suited on the button, and this is actually just a missed play by me. There's a raise in early position, and I fold my King 6 suited. And again, as I was talking about earlier, because I have a big stack, and because I'm on the button especially, I should be playing these speculative hands. I mean, King 6 suited is not a good hand, especially against an undergun raiser. And if I flop a king, it looks really dangerous, but I'm going to know that I'm just not going to put that much money in. I make that decision before I make the call pre-flop. But my opponent is still almost 50 big blinds deep, and I need to be taking risks. I need to be forcing my opponents into awkward spots when I have such a huge chip advantage. I have more than twice as many chips as anyone else at the table, and the best time to do that is on the button, and King 6 suited is definitely strong enough. So as a missed opportunity by me, I just wanted to highlight that. Next hand. Oh, this is another mistake that I make. Just a weird pot. I don't know what I was thinking. And it doesn't cost me many chips, but it's just when you go back after a tournament and you look at these hands, there's always a few of them where I'm just like, why? Why did I do that? And this is one of those hands. So this is a loose raise to begin with. I don't hate the raise. Ace 9 offsuit in early position. Again, I'm deep stacked. I'm looking to play a lot of pots. The table has been fairly tight, and I want to get as many chips into my stack as quickly as possible in this tournament. So I don't mind the raise. I get called in one spot, I believe, and everyone else folds. And I get a suited flop of 10-8-6. And this is where the problems begin. I have a gut shot straight draw and an ace high, and it's a suited flop, which is usually a good flop to c-bet on, because your opponent, I mean, unless they have a card of that suit or a strong pair, or there's just really not that much that they can continue on, and people tend to play pretty scared on these suited flops when you show aggression. Also, I have the gut shot, also I have the ace outs, so this is a clear bet, but I check, and my opponent checks behind. Now the turn comes and pairs the 6. I check again, which after checking on the flop, I mean, I might as well check again, but this is the silly part. My opponent bets, and I decide my ace high is good enough for a call. I can't explain to you guys what I was thinking here. I don't know what I was thinking. I mean, again, ace high might be good enough for a call, but once I miss my opportunity to bet, the last thing I want to be doing is calling and playing guessing games with an ace high on a suited board. It's just the worst, absolute worst way to play this hand. If I'm going to be losing chips after the flop on this hand, I want to be losing them aggressively, not by trying to snap off a bluff when I have ace high and really only a gut shot. So somehow I decided that's a good time to call. And then the fourth heart comes out, and I miss my chance to bet again. Now, you could say that it would be a bad play to bet here because it's very likely that my opponent has a heart, and there's a good chance that my opponent does have a heart, and if he does, I'm likely burning more money. But by getting into this situation, the way I've played the hand so far, the only way that I can win this hand, and the only way that my play up to this point makes any sense, is if I was planning to steal this pot, and yet given the perfect opportunity to steal this pot, I don't. So this is just a painful hand to rewatch for me, but I wanted to point it out to you guys, and hope that you guys won't make the same mistakes. Basically, if you're playing loose and you're raising weak hands, c-bet them. Don't try to call down and get your opponent's bluffing, because it's just not the right way to play. And he checks and shows an ace-jack. So he was bluffing, but he was actually making an accidental value bet because his ace is better than mine. And either way, I'm just not happy with the way I played this hand, and I'm going to continue on to the next one before I get angry. The next hand I want to discuss is Queen-Jack offsuit. I get it on the button. Good hand on the button, obviously, and I believe it folds around to me. Yeah, it does, and I make a pretty standard sized raise, and the big blind calls, and we get a flop of 10-7-3 with 2 hearts. I've been getting a lot of these kind of like low, semi-suited, semi-connected flops, and as I was talking about earlier, I don't really like c-betting on these flops. That being said, you've got to throw out a few c-bets, and I was looking at my stats after this tournament, and later on, my c-bets are quite frequent, but in the early stages, I was actually only c-betting about 45% of hands. And that's really bad because that basically means I was only c-betting when I had a hand and about 15% of the other times. And that's just not a good style to have, especially when you're the big stack. So even though this is not the best board for c-betting, I mean, when you're c-betting, what you really want to see is one high card and two low cards, and you can represent the high card, and you can kind of push people around that way. But this board is not, it's not like the 4-6-5 with two hearts on it. It's not like it's directly connected, and it is very possible to represent a 10 here as well. So this would have been a good spot for a c-bet, but I don't. The turn comes a 5 of hearts. It goes check, check again. River's a king, and my opponent bets. So I've dug my own grave here. There's nothing I can do. I have to fold. And this is likely a spot where I could have taken down the pot with a c-bet. So another hand that I'm not especially happy with. But that's okay. Poker is not a game where you will ever be perfect. Here I have King 8 suited in the cutoff, and I just wanted to point out the blinds have gone up again, and King 8 suited, I mean, even if I wasn't deep stacked, this is a strong enough hand to raise with from the cutoff. Suited kings in general are pretty good, and the blinds are getting big enough now that they're worth stealing, and King 8 suited is more than enough. And in this case, it's just nobody calls, and we go ahead and take down a pot. The next hand I want to discuss, I have 9-9 under the gun, and obviously I'm going to make a raise. Same basic sizing, it's just a bit less than 2.5 big blinds, and as I was discussing earlier, I think that's more or less the smallest type raises that I like making. 2.3 is basically my cutoff, 2.3 big blinds. I don't usually raise any less than that. And I believe I get called in two, no, I only get called in one place here. And this is a flop, again, like where I could c-bet, but at the time I got kind of scared. The big blind is going to be calling wider than any other position. There's less aces and kings in his range than any other position. And even though there's two high cards and they're suited, it's still a really good spot for me to represent at least one of them and try to take down this pot. Especially with my big stack, I should be c-betting aggressively. But in this case, I don't. And the board pairs up on the turn, and he bets into me, and I could make a hero raise, but I'm done with the hand. There's nothing really that I can do. I missed my opportunity to make a c-bet, and who knows, maybe I saved myself some money, but looking over these hands, this is a trend that I'm not that proud of, and you should definitely try to avoid being timid c-betting when you're deep stacked. Even when you're not that deep stacked. I mean, in tournaments, you want to c-bet less than you do in cash games as a general rule, because conserving your chips is worth more than winning the chips that are out there. So whereas in a cash game, I might c-bet roughly 75% of hands, maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more, depending on the game. In tournaments, I'm usually c-betting closer to 60 or 65% of the hands. But once you have a deep stack, you need to be c-betting at least as much as you do in cash games. Again, closer to 75% of hands, because you really want to be exploiting your chip advantage to put pressure on your opponents and win as much as you can, or at least force them to some tough decisions. Anyway, a couple hands later, I pick up 8-6 suited in the small blind. And there's a raise and a call in front of me, and I just want to point out, like, if you're missing these kind of pots, you're, even with way less chips, this is a great spot to call, because it's only a min raise, and there's actually two callers in front of me. So with 900 chips already out there, so 1050, 1125 chips already out there, I have to call 225 to continue. So I'm getting almost 5 to 1. In fact, I think I'm getting exactly 5 to 1 on the call. So it's a pretty clear call with 8-6 suited. I mean, obviously something silly could happen, like the big blind re-raising, but with a high implied odds like 8-6 suited, when you're getting real odds of 5 to 1, if you're not calling, even 4 to 1, if you're not calling, you're leaving money on the table. In this particular situation, I flop a gut shot. There is an argument for continuing with the hand here, because the person betting 600 into a 1350 pot, that's less than half the pot. There's a call in between, and myself and the person betting both have well over 100 big blinds. So you could make an argument for the implied odds of the money I'd make on a gut shot coming in would be worth the 600 investment, but I think it's pretty close and pretty unlikely that I'm going to be getting paid off often enough for the 600 chip investment to be worth it. And either way, in this particular hand I folded. I only showed this hand because I wanted to point out the implied odds pre-flop and how important it is to be taking advantage of those spots. Next hand I wanted to discuss. This is just a hand that I don't play. And this is kind of like a cutoff. This is kind of like an inflection point. It would be the best way to put it. I have Jack 8 in the hijack, and I have a choice. It folds around to me. I have a choice whether to raise or not. And this is right about the borderline of when I'm deep stacked and I'm looking to steal pots. This is right about the borderline of hands that I would raise. And literally, if I had Jack 9, I would probably raise here. If I had Jack 8 suited, I would probably raise here. If I had Jack 7 suited, it would be a very close decision. But Jack 8 is right around the point where I don't want to be raising, even with a big stack, even like with over 100 big blinds. It's just not quite strong enough, even for my loose aggressive style that I want to be playing. In addition to that, there's a small blind over here that only has about 25 big blinds in his stack. So he's kind of at the stack point. I mentioned it on the side list there. Once your opponents start getting close to 20 big blinds or less, they're going to be looking for often they're going to be looking for opportunities to re-raise all in. Not all opponents, obviously. A lot of players don't know how to do that, especially at the lower levels. But once they start getting short stacked like that, they're going to be looking for opportunities to re-raise all in and either get you to fold or call when they have a strong hand. And so you need to be wary of the shorter stacks. And we're going to run into a few situations in this tournament where my decision changes based on the stack size of my opponents. But in this situation, I just wanted to point out that Jack 8 suited, I would probably raise here. Jack 9, I would probably raise here. But Jack 8 just isn't quite strong enough. And very next hand, lo and behold, I pick up Jack 9 suited. So as I was saying, Jack 9 suited, even one position earlier, is worth a raise. And I go with my pretty standard sizing. I get called in one spot, I believe. And we see a flop where I flop a flush draw. Now these hands are always a little bit awkward because you have the betting lead and you have a strong draw, but you also don't want to play a big pot with just a draw. So it's definitely worth a c-bet, which I go ahead and do. And you'll notice my sizing is a little bit on the small side. It's still much more than half of the pot, but it's less than 2/3 of the pot. And I do that intentionally here. Again, I don't think at these stakes you have to be too worried about small differences in your sizing alerting your opponents to the strength of your hand. And this way I give myself a little bit of a discount compared to my normal bet size on looking for my flush draw. And he does call. And the turn comes a blank. It's a 10 of clubs, so no extra outs for me. I just have a straight up flush draw. And here I have an interesting decision because now if I make a bet, it's a fairly significant portion of his stack. The pot's starting to become pretty large, and all I have is a flush draw. That being said, if I check, I'm basically giving up on the hand and leaving 2,000 chips in the middle that could be mine. I mean, obviously, if he checks behind and I hit a magical heart on the river, that would be great. But at this point, if I check, he's very likely to bet, and he'll probably won't be giving me a good enough price to chase my flush draw. In this particular, so it's a close decision. It kind of boils down to there's no right decision here. Depending on how it reads on your opponent, it could go either way. Depending on how you think your image is at the table, if you feel you have a tight image, you should lean towards betting here. If you feel you have a loose image, you should probably check and give up on the hand. Yeah, it's a really close decision. Anyway, in this particular case, I go ahead and bet. And again, I bet a little bit less than half the pot here. And he calls. In retrospect, my sizing, if I was going to bet, it should have been a little bit more than half the pot, at least, maybe about 1,100 instead of 850. But that's okay. He didn't raise, so we're still getting a really good price to see the river. And I missed my flush. I do pick up a pair. At this point, I don't really think I can bet. Nothing worse than my jack is going to call, and I don't think I'm folding out any aces. So the only point of betting would be as a blocker bet to prevent him from betting. But I check, and he makes a fairly large bet. I mean, it's less than half the pot, but it's the majority of his stack is... it's actually less than half his stack, but it's a pretty significant bet relative to our stack sizes. And I thought about trying to call here, but it was really not even close. It's possible he also has a busted flush draw, but there's just way too many cards that beat me now, and it's very likely that he was calling with an ace and not raising because he didn't want to build a huge pot, but now he's looking to get value, and my pair of jacks is just in deep water here. So this is, I don't mind the way I played this hand. It ended up being pretty expensive for just a flush draw that didn't turn into anything, but it's good to be aggressive with your draws, and it's not always going to work out, and that's just part of the game, and I don't mind the way that this hand was played. As I said, the turn is a close decision, one way or the other, between betting or checking and giving up on the hand. But the bet is definitely a reasonable option. The next hand I want to discuss is Queen 9 offsuit in the big blind, and this is the hand where there's a big there's this min raise under the gun, and this is one of the reasons why I don't like min raising myself. Is it gives me such a good price to call in the big blind with a wide range of hands, and I wouldn't call with much worse than Queen 9 here. I mean, certainly a lot of suited connectors and low pairs and like 10-8s and stuff like that would also be in my range, but I wouldn't be calling with like a Queen 7 here. But a Queen 9 is strong enough that for that good a price, I'm going to call. And we see a flop where I get top pair on a paired board, and I'm not too excited about my hand. It's very possible that an under the gun raiser has a hand like 2 queens or 2 jacks, and I'm in pretty deep trouble here. But I'm also very aware that my opponent could have missed this flop, and he checks behind after I check, so at this point, I'm pretty sure my hand is best, especially once the 3 of the heart comes on the turn. That's not likely to have hit him, and I can start trying to extract value and protect my hand. So I make a bet of about 2/3 on the turn, and he makes a quick call. So I don't really know what that means, but I still am of the opinion that my Queen 9 is in the lead. And the river comes a 10, which is basically a blank. I mean, it fills in a few straight draws, but I doubt that that's what he was raising with previously, and there aren't that many 10s in his under the gun raising range anyway, so it's unlikely that my pair if my pair was good, it's unlikely that it's not good now. So that being said, I don't expect to get much value from my hand at this point. So I'm happy to just check, which is what I do. And he fires out about a half pot bet, and I kind of smirked when I saw this because there was just no. You really have to pay attention to the story of a hand, and there was just no hand to me that made sense that he would check behind on the flop, call on the turn, and then on this relatively unimportant 10 decide to bet on the river. So to me, it looked like a pretty clear situation where my opponent was bluffing. Even before I called, I was smiling about the fact that he bet. And yeah, it worked out well for me. I mean, he had a hand that I did not put in his range, low suited connectors. I don't expect to see people raising those from under the gun. Not that you shouldn't do it from time to time. When you're deep stacked, raising a small suited connector under the gun can be a good way to mix up your play, especially if you've been kind of card dead. Your opponents are less likely to be calling. They're more likely to give you some respect. And if you're comfortable playing post flop and making bluffs like he did, then it can be a good play to just get into a couple more hands. That being said, I really don't like the way he played his hand. It was pretty face up to me that he was bluffing, and yeah, just not a very strong play in my opinion. Next hand, we're getting close to the end now. The next hand I wanted to go over is one that I'm not involved in, but I just wanted to, A, it's kind of a crazy hand, and B, I wanted to discuss a typical pitfall of a certain hand or a certain category of hands. So we get a limp under the gun, and then the cutoff raises to 3 times the big blind, and both the small blind and the big blind call. So we have 4 people to the flop and a relatively large pot, 1,800 pre-flop is, it's pretty significant at this stage of the tournament. I mean, for 2 of the players, it basically represents a third of their stack pre-flop. And we get a flop of King 10 or King Queen Jack rainbow, so no flush draws, but obviously a very connected board. And the small blind shoves all in. Now he has a lot more chips than anyone else, but that's still a really strange play. And right away, like when I saw this play, I kind of thought 10-9 was the hand that he was holding, because it kind of looks like he has a really strong hand that's vulnerable. I mean, the other hands that might make sense here are a set of queens, a set of jacks, a set of kings even, but you might have seen more action from him pre-flop than what you did. He just flat called in the small blind. And so to me, this looks like a vulnerable hand that's trying to protect itself / get value on the flop. But this is just, I don't like overbetting the pot so significantly here. Anyway, he shoves and all 3 players call. So this is kind of crazy. You almost never see pots like this at this stage of the tournament, or ever in multi-table tournaments. So I thought this was pretty amusing. I'm going to show you guys the hands before we watch it run out. And yeah, he had exactly, I mean, obviously at the time of recording this video, I know what he had, but even while I was playing in the tournament, I kind of thought when I saw the shove 10-9, and that's exactly what he had. The big blind, that's just a little bit sad. He's risking 3 times the size of the pot, more than 3 times the size of the pot when this player shoves on a draw, and he's got 40 big blinds in his stack. It's not like he's desperate right now, so I'm not sure what he was thinking. And what I wanted to talk about in this hand is there's 2 players here with ace-10, so they're going to chop the pot. We don't even need to watch it run out. It's a foregone conclusion at this point. What I wanted to talk about in this hand is hands like 10-9 suited and 9-8 suited. Normally, if you flop a 2-card straight and it's the bottom end of the straight, you're still golden. Like if you have 6-7 and the flop is 10-8-9, I mean, Queen Jack is definitely in your opponent's range, but Jack 7 is unlikely, and you really want to get as much money in as you can. When you have a hand like 10-9 or 9-8, 9-8 flops straights on Queen Jack 10, and 10-9 flops straight on King Queen Jack. You need to be a little bit more wary. I mean, I don't know if I've ever actually no, I definitely have in Deepstack cash games folded those hands in those situations, but in a tournament I don't know if I've ever found a fold with those hands. But you have to be aware that uh, your the hands that beat you, the straights that beat you, like if you have 10-9, ace 10 beats you, that's a fairly common hand for your opponent to be holding. If you have 9-8 on a 10 Jack Queen board, ace king beats you, and that's obviously a very common hand for your opponent to be playing. So you need to be careful in these situations when you flop the low end of the straight. With those two hands in particular, 10-9 suited and 8-9 suited, you see it very often. Those hands on the low end of the straight end up losing all of their money, and there's not much you can do. I mean, when you flop a straight, you basically want to be getting all the money in, but with those two hands in particular, you need to be giving it a second thought and at least consider the possibility that you're beat. All right, the next hand I want to discuss is kind of an exciting one for me. I'm in the small blind with aces, and it's always nice to see the rockets, and this is especially nice when you have aces. You see a raise and then a 3-bet in front of you, and me, when that happens, I'm just licking my chops, trying not to drool all over my keyboard, because obviously we're going to play a bit of a pot here. And the only downside of having two raises in front of you when you have aces is that by making the third raise, you're pretty much turning your hand face up. It's pretty obvious at that point that you have aces or kings, maybe queens or ace king, but unless the stacks are much shorter than they are in this situation, you're really not going to be doing this with much less than aces or kings, and your opponents, if they're good players, are going to be aware of that. So once you make the downside of seeing two raises in front of you is once you make the third raise, you're likely not going to get much action. That being said, as I've said before, I'm not a big fan of slow playing, and unless you're on the button or in the cutoff when you're pretty much guaranteed to have position later in the hand, I would never slow play aces here. Out of position, you really want to get as much money as you can in pre-flop and just hope that your opponent finds a hand that he's committed to. So I do make a small 4-bet here, about just over twice the size of my opponent's bet, which is small on the small side, but considering his stack size and the fact that this is the 4th bet going in, you really don't need a big bet to A, get value, and B, force folds from weaker hands. And I want to do both of those things. Even though I have aces, I would prefer to play this hand heads up. And luckily that's exactly what happens. I get a fold from the initial raiser and the 3-better calls. So I'm out of position, but I have aces, and this is a pretty standard bet. Is less than half the size of the pot, but my opponent only has about the size of the pot in his hand. So pretty much any bet that I make is going to be putting him to a decision for all of his chips. And I want to give, as I've said in the last video, when I'm putting my opponent to a decision for all his chips, I want to give him the chance to make the last bet. It's just more likely under those circumstances that all of his money is going to go in. In my experience, at least, it's more likely that players will put all their money in when you give them a chance to make the last bet. So if you have a strong enough hand that you want all of their money in, you should always give them the chance to make the last bet. So I do, and he ends up shoving and has ace queen. So, I mean, I can understand his play. Realistically, once the fourth bet goes in pre-flop, a hand like ace-queen, it's not like he was desperate for chips. He was fairly short-stacked, but it's not like he was desperate for chips. A hand like ace-queen should probably be folded there. Obviously, once the flop comes down, he's never folding, and it's just unlucky that he's up against an overpair, and he obviously doesn't catch anything by the river. So too bad, so sad. Good game, sir. Thank you for the chips. I am now sitting with a very healthy stack. The blinds are still 75, 150, and I have about 23,000 chips. I believe, oh no, it's a couple hands later. Oh yeah, okay, this is a hand I raised king 4 suited from the hijack. And this is a bit of a loose raise, but one of my reasons for raising here is that the big blind is one of the other deep stacks, or he's the other deepest stack at the table, and I want to be playing pots against him. I've noticed that he's made a couple of weird decisions over the course of the past hands, including that hand where he shoved with 10-9 into a pot that was like not even a quarter of the size of the shove he was making. So I've kind of identified him as maybe not a loose player, maybe not a particularly weak player, but a player that under the right circumstances I can win a lot of money from. So I do want to play pots against him. King 4 suited is pretty weak, but I still feel good about the raise here. And I do end up getting called from my target player. But his trend of large bets continues, and he's betting out of position, not as the raiser on the flop, and that's often a sign of weakness, but the sizing of his bet is such that I cannot continue with my king 4 and a weak pair of fours, so I fold, and he ends up, I'll show you the rest of the hand, he ends up making another big bet on the turn, and gets called again by the button, and then he shoves on the river and the button folds. So obviously I'm very glad I folded my king 4. I don't know what he had, but this player has been making a number of plays like this, so it's likely that either he's a bit on tilt and he's just trying to bully everyone, or his typical strategy is just to bully everyone, or he's been getting a really hot run of cards. But my laser beams are definitely pointed in his direction. I'm definitely paying attention to him because we may get into a situation where he's betting a lot and I get a chance to call him with a hand that I might normally fold against most players. That being said, I don't really want to play lots of pots against someone that's really aggressively betting, because it becomes quite difficult to continue, because let's be fair, in Hold'em it's hard to make big hands, and it's one of the beautiful things about the game is that you really need to be comfortable playing with less than big hands, and unfortunately when someone's putting a lot of pressure on you with big bets, it can be difficult. Next hand I want to show, this will actually be the last hand that I cover in this video, and I just want to point out that player that I was talking about making the big bets, he's just in the past 3 hands or so, he's lost a third of his stack. So probably someone else noticed. In fact, I think it was the middle position 2 player here must have noticed that he was being a little bit over aggressive and probably caught him. I don't remember what hand it was. I'm not going to take the time to go back and find it, but just want to point out to you that that style is kind of a live by the sword, die by the sword style, and that it can be pretty dangerous to play that way. So the last hand I want to share with you guys, Pocket Kings. This is a pretty straightforward hand as far as my strategy goes, but there was a couple things I wanted to highlight. It's a raise in early position. I get 1 caller and just a dream flop. Like, as you can see, throughout this portion of the tournament, my hands have just been very good, much better than average. I've had lots of pocket pairs. I haven't lost any big pots when I've had them, and I think this is the second set that I've flopped. if not the third, going back all the way to the start of the tournament. And I mean, in a normal tournament, if you flop one set or two, that's really lucky. And we're still quite early in this tournament. I've already flopped 3. Anyway, that being said, I'm going to obviously try to get some value here. And it's important to note that when I get this dream flop, I'm not slow playing. It's very unlikely that my opponent caught anything that he's going to continue with. But if he did catch something he wants to continue with, the only way I'm going to get money from him is betting. I mean, unless he has a 9, a check raise is just going to scare him off a hand like pocket 10s or pocket 7s or ace queen that he might otherwise call a bet or two with. And if he happens to have the last king in the deck, I'm losing money by check raising. So unless he has a 9, the check raise check raise is really a bad play, and I want to be getting some money in on this flop, so I definitely have to make a bet. And lo and behold, he actually raises, so this is great. I face a decision now of whether I want to 3-bet and try to get all the money in, or whether I want to just call, and I like to just call. I think it's the much stronger play. My hand's basically invulnerable, and this gives him a chance. If he's the type of player that likes to fight on these kind of dry boards that look like it's hard to hit anything, one high card, a paired board, these are the type of boards that some players like to fight on because they know it's hard to hit this board with anything strong. So it's very possible that he's just making a raise here to try and steal, and he might follow that up with another bet on the turn. So I'm going to give him that chance. I actually just call and then check on the turn to him, and he makes a nice big bet. So at this point, I think my play is pretty evident. It's pretty obvious that he's committed to this hand. If he is bluffing, then I've already taken as many chips as I'm going to from him. I doubt that he'll bluff the rest of his chips on the river. And even if he would, and I'm losing those chips by making a raise here, I'm willing to take that chance because he looks like he's committed to the hand. So I do make a raise to all in, and he calls. And that 10 of hearts was actually really unlucky for him because he was bluffing on the flop, but he hit a straight on the turn with his gut shot. Yet that straight is no good because I have a full house and he's drawing dead. So again, I'll end a video on a hand where I win a nice big pot. The blinds at this point of the tournament are still 75-150, and I'm sitting with just about 200 big blinds. And in the next video, we're going to get into the stage of the tournament where the antes kick in and people are starting to get eliminated a lot quicker. And you'll see me playing against stacks a lot closer to my own size. And there's definitely some interesting hands coming up. So I hope you guys are as excited as I am. And thank you very much for watching. Again, if there's any comments, feedback, whatever, let me know what you thought of the music. I know it cut off partway through the video. I didn't have a chance to fix that. So if you enjoyed it, then the next video I'll make sure it's in the whole video. And if you didn't enjoy it, you only had to put up with it for half the video. So no worries anyway. I hope you guys are having a good time at the tables and crushing it and learning lots from these videos. And I'll post another one soon. See you later.